In first century Jewish culture, Moses was the man. He was the lawgiver, the one who stood face to face with God. He split the Red Sea. He led 2 million people out of slavery. Rabbis taught that there was no prophet greater than Moses who had ever lived or ever would live. So when the writer here of Hebrews says Jesus is greater than Moses, that's not a minor claim. He now has the attention of his entire Hebrew audience. So let's see how he makes his case. In Hebrews chapter 3, verses 1 through 6, it starts with therefore. So you must see what it is there for. And what follows is being built on everything that came before it. There with my lesson 1 and 2, established who Jesus is. He's the creator, the sustainer, heir of all things. He's superior to the angels, the one who sat down at the right hand of the Father because his work was finished. Therefore, in light of all of that, the writer says, consider Jesus. And that word there in the Greek means to fix your mind on something carefully. So it's not just a glance, but it's a deliberate gaze. The writer is saying, really look at him. And here's what you need to see. Jesus is your apostle and he's your high priest. Jesus is an apostle. He is the sent one. And that would be someone who is dispatched with full authority to represent the one who sent him. And Jesus was sent by the Father as the authoritative representative of God to humanity. And that's what lesson 1 established. And basically, Jesus is God's final word. But he is also a high priest. A high priest stands between the people and God. He represents sinful humans before a holy God. He makes atonement. He intercedes. So Jesus is both apostle and high priest. He's both at the same time. He comes from God to man and represents man before God. The mediator he's the mediator in both directions. 1 Timothy 2:5. There is one God and one mediator between God and man, the man Christ Jesus. Now the comparison to Moses, and the writer is careful here. He doesn't want to dismiss Moses or tear him down because he acknowledges what every Jewish believer knew. Moses was faithful, because that's what God said in Numbers 12. He said, my servant Moses, he is faithful in all my household. But, so here's the distinction. Moses was faithful in the house. Jesus is faithful over the house. So Moses was a servant, but Jesus is a son. He's the heir of all things. And the analogy the writer uses is the builder versus the building. Think about it this way. You can admire a building's architecture, the craftsmanship, the every detail in a room, but the glory belongs to the builder, not to the building. The building points to the one who made it. And Moses was part of the house. Everything he did. The law, the tabernacle, the priesthood, the sacrificial system, and this was all pointing forward to something greater. The law was not the destination, it was a signpost. So, Jesus built the house and then he walked into it. And Moses was a servant, giving testimony about things to come. And Jesus is the Son, and he is what Moses was testifying about. The law doesn't explain Jesus. Jesus explains the law. So this would be where it gets specific, and this would have hit the original Hebrew audience the hardest. Under the Old Covenant, the high priest could only enter the most holy place on the Day of Atonement, which was once a year, according to Leviticus 16. He would take the blood of bulls and goats, pass through the veil. He would sprinkle blood on the mercy seat, which was the throne of God. And, that sacrifice covered the sins of the people for 1 year. So, 5 minutes after him walking out, and, every new sin that happened was uncovered. Thus starting the cycle again and again, year after year. And, so here's what's critical. The high priest had to first he had to offer a sacrifice for himself because, he was a sinner too. He needed atonement before he could make an atonement for anyone else, before he could even walk into the presence of God. So now compare that with Jesus. Jesus had no sin of his own to cover. He didn't need to offer a sacrifice for himself. He walked through death not as a sinner paying a penalty, but as the sinless Son, absorbing the penalty on everyone, who would believe. And his blood doesn't just cover for 1 year of sin. It covers past, present, and future. It's permanent. It's continual. It's complete. Hebrews will keep building on this on the next 3 lessons, next chapters. But the foundation is laid right here. Jesus is not a better version of the Levitical priesthood. He's the reality of the priesthood, of what it was all pointing to. It was pointing to him the whole time. So there, verses 7 through 19, the writer shifts from an argument to a warning. He goes straight to Israel's history to make his point. He quotes Psalm 95. Today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts, as when they provoked me in the day of trial in the wilderness. So every Jewish person knew the wilderness story. They knew it all about their ancestors. They knew it by heart. How God delivered Israel out of Egypt with signs and wonders that no one had ever seen before. The 10 plagues, the Red Sea split in half, manna from heaven, water from a rock, pillar of fire by day, or fire at night, cloud by day, 40 years of supernatural provision. And yet they still didn't believe him. They grumbled, they rebelled, they made a golden calf when Moses was receiving the law on the mountain. They looked at the promised land. It was within grasp, and they said, the giants are too big, and they didn't want to enter in. And God said, enough. That generation will not get to enter my rest. They will not get to enter the promised land. They're going to die in the wilderness. So here's what the writer is pointing out. These weren't pagans he was talking to, who have never heard. These were the people of God, the ones who saw every miracle firsthand, and they had every reason to trust, but, they chose not to. And the consequence was that they never got what was promised to them. Israel didn't get to enter the promised land. And the warning is there to the Hebrew believers direct, and, to us. You're in the same danger because you know the truth. Verse 12, take care, brethren, that there not be any of you of an evil, unbelieving heart that falls away from a living God. So the danger is, unbelief, not just atheism or outright rejection, but the slow internal drift from trusting Christ's finished work. And then you start beginning on your trusting in your own performance, your own religious activity, your own efforts to stay right with God. And, that's that's a hardening. That's the wilderness generation. They had the promises of God in their hands, and they let it go. But, we have the antidote there in verse 13. It's really just community. Encourage one another day after day, as long as it's still called a day, so that none of you will be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. The deceitfulness of sin is that, it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't walk in and say, I'm here to harden your heart. But it's a quiet erosion of confidence in, what Christ has done. It becomes replaced slowly by confidence in what you're doing, in your own abilities. The remedy is, to have other believers speak in truth into your life. You need people, who will look you in the face and say, hey, don't drift. The work is finished. Trust in Jesus. The wilderness generation didn't have this type of accountability, and they really just fed off each other's unbelief until they were all hardened. And verses 18 and 19 closes with a verdict on the wilderness generation. They were disobedient and not able to enter because of unbelief. So disobedience and unbelief, two words that describe the same root problem, really just refusing to take God at his word. So, Jesus is superior to Moses. Moses was the greatest servant the house ever had. But servants don't save you. Only the Son can. And that Son, he's done it completely, permanently, once and for all. He walked in, with his own blood and, cleanses us once and for all forever. So the question this lesson puts in front of you, is the same one, put in front of these first century believers. Are you trusting the Son? Or are you quietly adding, your performance back into the equation? So are you holding fast or are you drifting? Today, if you hear his voice, don't harden your heart. Next lesson, we'll be entering into his rest. They're in Hebrews 4, and we'll see what it actually means to rest in what Jesus has done, and why so many people are still striving when the work is already finished. I have a study guide that I'll send you. I'll put the link for the email. It'd be a free PDF, or if you want an actual journal, I guess you'd say, I'll put the Amazon link in there. So thanks for watching.